Hey friends, welcome to But What If You Did, the podcast where we share the empowering, encouraging stories from millennials thriving in the messy transitional seasons of life. I'm your host, Alyson, and I'm a millennial on a mission to show you what's possible when you stop playing it safe and lean into those uncomfortable growth seasons in life. These conversations are literal proof that you too can go from surviving to thriving. It's about building what I call your mindset toolkit and taking action even when it feels hard. And well, on that note, time is our most valuable resource. So grab some coffee and let's get to today's conversation. Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of But What If You Did, the podcast where we share the empowering, encouraging stories from millennials thriving in the messy transitional seasons of life. I'm your host, Alyson, and I cannot express how much it means to me that you came to hang with me for a bit today. I feel like I've had some pretty big life updates to share pretty much every week, so I'm going to keep this week short and sweet and just say that moving was once again an adventure for both Elliot and myself, and while we are absolutely settling into a bit of a new lifestyle, I just really hope that life keeps the curveballs at bay for a little while because, wow, there have been a lot of them lately, and I'm tired and I need a break. So this is me sending that out into the universe and hoping that the universe has my back on that one. So before we get to today's conversation, I just want to preface this with, if you are job searching or opportunity searching in any capacity, I would love for you to grab a notebook so that you can take notes and come back when you are able to sit down and listen to this, and maybe not on the go. I know I always listen to podcasts when I'm out driving or running or walking, and I don't have a notebook in front of me, but I think this is one of those ones where you're going to want to be able to take some notes. The conversation is definitely geared towards the millennial that wants to pivot, and they think they have no skills to do so, because that simply isn't the truth. And we're going to dive into some really tangible tips along the way. Emily DeSilva is one of the co-founders of Cultivated Talent, which is a recruitment agency for the beauty, lifestyle, and fashion industry. They specialize in full-time direct hire placements for small to mid-sized companies. But what really sets them apart is they offer this really cool candidate concierge service to help candidates across all industries who need extra help in their own job searching with resume writing, portfolio review, and even LinkedIn strategy. In today's conversation, we focus on how to build and foster professional relationships and really how those relationships are key to starting down a new path and opening new doors for yourself. All right, friends. Grab some coffee or your preferred beverage of choice, and let's get to today's conversation with Emily. All right, friends. Well, welcome back. I am so excited to introduce you to another really phenomenal millennial. This is Emily. Emily, welcome to the show. Go ahead and tell everyone a little bit about your story.
Thank you. I am the co-founder of Cultivated Talent, which is a beauty, lifestyle, and fashion recruiting firm. I'm the co-founder, so my business partner Kelly and I worked together prior to this, and really in light of COVID, just decided we wanted to do something a little bit different. And even though it seemed like a crazy time to start a business, it actually turned out to be the best time, and here we are.
I love that. I've actually found that to be a lot of people's stories lately is it feels like a crazy time to start a business, but I also think like as a generation, it kind of gave us a chance to hit the reset button. And a lot of us started to see what was really important to us and started to see that we had a lot more control when we put ourselves in the driver's seat.
That's exactly it. In such a chaotic time, it was a way to take back a little bit of that control and at least feel like you had some impact with what you were doing after kind of taking inventory on what was happening and where you really wanted to be and just deciding, well, now's as good of time as any and let's just go for it and see what happens.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, that's pretty much why I started the podcast was now is as good a time of any. Might as well try something new.
Exactly.
So tell us how you got started in the recruiting space and what kind of led you to getting into, taking that pivot, that transition to go towards leading your own HR firm with Cultivated Talent.
Sure. So I actually started in the fashion industry and I worked in corporate for about 5 years. And then I was just kind of ready to try something new. I was traveling a lot at the
Hmm.
time and knew I wanted a change, but I wasn't sure what that looked like. And I happened to run into a friend of mine through my network, and she was a recruiter and let me know that they were looking for another fashion recruiter to join their team. And the timing just was perfect. So I dove headfirst into recruiting and loved it and didn't look back. It was a really good way for me to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of the industry, and learn something new. And so I didn't have to necessarily learn a new industry. I could leverage off of the industry I was already comfortable with and just learn the recruiting side of the business. So I did that for about 5 years. And then, as previously mentioned, when COVID hit, it was just timing and circumstance that
Hmm.
led my business partner, Kelly, and I to start Cultivated Talent and just really try and pivot with the changing times.
I think that is, it's like I said, it's a story of our time right now, right? And
Yeah.
it's so exciting to hear so many millennials going off and trying new things and finding success in doing hard things in the middle of hard seasons.
Yeah, it is.
So on the podcast, we talk with a lot of other millennials and we talk with a lot of people that are really struggling with career transitions right now.
Mhm.
I come from the entertainment industry where the entire industry basically turned into mush overnight. And one day we were all employed and the next day we were all unemployed.
Yeah.
And while I've been fortunate to go back to work, a lot of my peers and coworkers are either still furloughed or they're still trying to make that decision for what it is they want to do next. And for a lot of them, that is making a pivot to different industries or, well, maybe this entertainment doesn't give you a lot of flexibility, right? Like your life is kind of owned by the industry, as I'm sure it's similar with like fashion and some of that
Yeah.
lifestyle things. And so people are starting to go down these paths of like, okay, what's actually fulfilling and what is
Mhm.
actually going to bring me the most joy. And, I think sometimes when I'm talking to people and we're looking at their resumes and stuff, I hear a lot of things like, I don't know how to network anymore. I don't know what it means when I meet with someone in person. Um, what advice can you have to share around that? Working in the recruiting space, what is it that stands out to you?
Yeah, so they're certainly not alone. And that is something we see with our candidates all the time, especially in this year, is that they've really taken stock and inventory on what they really want to do, what makes them happy. Work is where they spend most of their time and if they're really fulfilled. So they're certainly in good company there. But networking is a skill, and most people aren't just naturally good at it. You have to kind of work at it, and it can be really intimidating. But I think the nice thing is with technology is that it's making people much more accessible than ever before, and they can kind of start small on a platform like LinkedIn, where
Right?
a lot of employees are, or other like-minded people, and you just kind of can connect with somebody with a click of a button and send a little note. And I like to kind of start off with some sort of mutual connection or a similarity, something where I'm creating that like, know, and trust, because that's the groundwork and the foundation that you're going to need to have when it comes to networking. It's not to network with an agenda and something that you're going to be sticking your hand out for help right away. It's something that you have to really nurture and grow, and even offer value to somebody else before you can kind of come back and say, okay, now I need your help. You have to establish that first. So I think doing that virtually, as we've all had to do in the last year, is a good place to kind of start. And then if you're in person, it can be a little intimidating, of course, but
Yeah.
you're there to kind of network, and somebody else is there too, and just kind of think that it's not easy for anybody else to be doing the same things. And again, it's kind of creating that familiarity. And I like other people to talk about themselves, and I find that's less intimidating because then I don't have to lead a conversation. I can start with a question and let them talk, and then once I hear what they want to talk about and what they have to say, I can start to pick out those familiar things or those things that I can connect with them on, and then start kind of furthering the conversation. And it's really just as simple as that. I think it doesn't have to be so complicated. It can be very simple, but you just kind of have to just start.
I remember someone early on saying, in my career, one of the leaders that like worked in the area I was working in the time, he was like, people like to talk about themselves.
They
Like
do.
you just have to give them a chance to talk about themselves. And I
Yes.
remember thinking at the time, like, oh, that's really weird advice. But anytime I've felt like that in a networking situation, I feel like that's always been my fallback of like, remember, they just want to talk about themselves. If you don't know what to say, just let them talk.
Exactly. It's always good
I
to just
also
listen.
think yes. And I think I think sometimes as a generation, we make things to be way more complicated. Like we want there to be a cookie cutter rule book for everything because that's just kind of how we were raised. We
Yeah.
look for that checkbox and that checklist. It's okay, this is how you're going to set up a meet and greet. This is exactly what you're going to say. This is like we want it to be our project management software that tells us what to do. And I think sometimes it's just not practical to expect there to be a life checklist with everything. And so we overcomplicate things in our mind and we sit in this analysis paralysis of,
Right.
oh my God, I don't know what to do. When really, like, you do know what to do. You just, like you said, it's those common things. So I love that you pointed that out.
Yeah. Just start
So,
small and go from there.
yeah, I love that. When somebody reaches out to you, say, to network with you, what is something that like catches your attention that would like make you want to respond back to them or to have an interest in speaking to them more?
Good question. I think it's if I've seen that somebody's doing their homework. So if they've looked at my past
Mm,
history, they know that I was a former athlete, or and it's right on LinkedIn. It's right there. They don't have to do much
right.
digging. Or if they're looking at my activity on LinkedIn, they can see I've commented on some things or I have a featured section. There's a lot of different things that they could just, low hanging fruit kind of type a note on and say, hey, I saw that you were doing this and I'm really interested. Would you mind, telling me more about this or whatever that might
Yeah.
be? It's just something genuine, but it helps them stand out versus somebody else coming to me with their own agenda. I'm
Mm.
more than happy to make time for somebody and help them any way I can. But if they're just leading with their own agenda, it's harder for me to prioritize that.
That's great advice. It's so funny because we've talked a lot lately with different people about how to use those internet resources, right? So whether it's LinkedIn or even now in our world, like you can use Instagram for so
Yeah.
much of this too. And I think that people look at Instagram as like a social media tool rather than a networking tool, and it
Mhm.
totally can be a networking tool. But it is about finding those common threads. And I think while I talk a lot about entrepreneurship just because that's the path that I'm currently going down and living through right now, I think so much of what I'm learning as an entrepreneur is also applicable to how I present myself at work and how I am growing my career in my corporate space too. And I think sometimes we forget that they're very parallel paths in some ways.
Absolutely. And I think now more than ever that formality has kind of gone away a little bit with these
Mm,
social platforms. So you can just kind of have a conversation with somebody and build that relationship a little bit without making it feel so stiff and so formal.
yeah. So, another thing that I've noticed lately is that a lot of people are talking about how much more important soft skills are. And, I know as somebody, I spent 8 months of last year furloughed. And during that time, I was applying for a lot of jobs, not because I really wanted a new job, but because at that point, that was what society was telling you should want in the middle of a pandemic when you're up
Mhm,
against all these other applicants.
mhm.
And it became really mentally taxing to just have to apply and change your resume and change your cover letter and whatever. And it was really interesting because so many of the job postings were so focused on hard skills. And then yet when you would go and talk to them later or you would like make those connections and look at what they were actually looking for, so much of it was soft skills.
Mhm.
What is your experience in like the recruiting space about soft skills? Like, is that something that you see a lot of people put on their resumes? How is that represented on resumes? Is that something you even recommend putting on resumes?
It's a good question. Soft skills can be really tricky because they're hard to prove on a resume, right? So anybody
Mm,
can claim that they're organized or that they have leadership skills, but how am I supposed to understand that just by reading your resume
right.
without seeing a laundry list of job responsibilities? And anybody could put that on there. So on a resume, you do want to focus on more of those hard skills in terms of software programs, languages, if somebody happened to speak more than just, one language, even social media platforms, if applicable, if they're in the digital space, all of those are, specific. And your bullet points should really reflect those quantifiables and achievements that you brought to the role. So somebody could very easily see the impact that you had to the business in those roles and how you were going to translate that into their business. But to your point, once you get in the interview, that's where those soft skills really come into play, because you have to be able to articulate the value that you can bring. And your resume is really just there for proof of concept of what you're talking about. And it's really those soft skills in terms of communication, confidence, which is very tricky during a pandemic when you're applying for a lot of jobs and competition is extremely fierce. And just honestly, it comes down to a little bit of sales too. If you're not able to sell yourself and the value that you're going to bring and what you've been able to do in your past roles to a potential employer, talent's only going to get you so far. You have to be able to then convey that and why that makes you stand out from somebody else. And I think also understanding those standout qualities that nobody else can claim as their own. So even away from those quantifiables and those achievables, what makes you stand out amongst others who may have a similar background to yours is a question we ask candidates all the time. And it's one of the hardest for them to answer because it's not a cookie cutter answer. It's subjective only to them. And that is almost like their elevator pitch. So to have that dialed in, that's where the soft skills come in, and to be able to think on your feet and to be able to ask those questions or answer those questions that they're asked.
I think, we hear a lot about the elevator pitch, and I think sometimes these words become really redundant or they just become overused, and therefore we kind of tune out to them. But something that someone said to me recently was, think of it as telling your story. And I thought that was a really good way of like, how do you tell your story in 30 seconds or how do you tell your story in 5 minutes?
Yeah.
But I love that you brought up that that's really where you let the soft skills shine, because that's a weird thing that like, I remember being told very early on, you interview well. No, I just tell stories about myself well, right? Like it's weird for me to be like, oh, you interview well. But now when you put it in that perspective, to me, it does feel like, oh, well, that's how they could tell. That's how they read soft skills, like you said, through the interview.
Often it's not the most, qualified or talented person on paper. It's the person who can talk about what they've been able to bring to their roles and connect with their potential employer. People want to work with people they like. So if you check the boxes on paper to get yourself an interview, now it's up to the soft skills and that capacity to get you the job.
I love that. So, I'm also curious, what have you noticed? Like, have you guys done like virtual interviews? Because I know that that's kind of something we've seen a lot of in this year too. And while I haven't done any virtual interviews yet, I'm like, well, I guess I kind of did one, but like it wasn't really a formal interview looking back. But like, what are some tips, advice, tricks that you've learned over the last year with virtual interviewing, and how do you really make that connection when it's through a video screen?
Yeah, it's challenging for sure. We always tell people, make sure you dress as if you were in person, head to toe, even down to the shoes. And for, candidates, we even tell them wear some sort of shoe that's going to give you confidence, and even better if it provides a little bit of a heel, only because it's going to help your posture. So it's certain things like that. And then your posture, if it's, strong, is going to make you come across more confident. So it's hard to convey sometimes those soft skills of confidence where you can't necessarily feel the energy of the other person if you're not directly in front of them. There's a screen. There's little tricks like that where it's like, well, if your posture is strong, that's going to convey confidence. You kind of want to match the cadence of the interviewer in terms of how quickly they're speaking. You want to mirror that a little bit so you're on that same page. There's little things like tricks like that where you can kind of get around the screen, so to speak. You don't want to be distracted by your reflection in the video. You want to try and look that person in the eye, which sounds very simple, but it's actually really hard to do. You see this little screen moving and you're like, okay, don't look at the screen, just look at the person. It's things like that where it takes practice, and it's repetition, and it's kind of like have these kind of things ready to go, have your resume in front of you, have those talking points ready to go, so you're not kind of fumbling around. You want to have a clear workspace, all the things that seem very simple, but those are really kind of those tricks that keep you on task to then kind of shine your best during that time.
Easy to do, easy not to do.
Yeah.
That was another thing I read in a book years ago, and that just like always sticks in my head when it's, you know, something that seems like such a menial task, and it's easy to do, but it's also easy for me to push it to the side and say, this doesn't really matter when it does matter.
It does. Yeah.
I love, there were so many good nuggets of wisdom there, but the tone and cadence was one that also stuck out to me, just because I think that's something that's really easy to not think about. I know I can be a fast talker, especially when I'm nervous. And so just being aware of speaking in a way that people are going to be able to follow and understand and stay with you is also, I think, really important.
Yeah, I think everybody's got something great to say, and you don't want it to get missed because you're speaking so fast. Like you said, the interviewer has to keep up with you and is really digesting what you're saying. So you want to make sure that nothing gets missed when you're talking about how great you are, essentially, to get the job.
Yeah. So let's dive into relationships a little bit and kind of building professional relationships. So I know that has kind of felt harder over the last year, and I see a lot of people and I hear a lot of people and I get a lot of comments in my DMs about just like really struggling to build relationships now that we've gone virtual, right? And of course, now that we're all virtual and everyone's kind of settled into this, now people are starting to go back to the office. But I went straight back to being in an in-person environment, and the dynamic shifted drastically, and how we network for positions drastically changed. There are no promotions right now. We don't know when that's going to come back. There's not the movement. I work in a massive company where there's a lot of movement within the company that kind of disappeared overnight. And so everyone's dynamics with each other kind of changed because you're not trying to impress anyone anymore, which sounds weird and crazy, right? But like, you don't have that motivation to go have these conversations because you're not looking 5 steps ahead right now. We're all just living day to day. So what advice do you have around how to build stronger relationships, especially now that we're in a virtual world, but also as we start to, you know, as everyone says, like go back to the real world or reintegrate into society in the way that we were used to prior to the pandemic?
Good question. I think, like you said, now it's really about the day to day and kind of just doing your best versus looking 5 steps ahead, because it is so uncertain still. Even though things are starting to go back into the office, it's kind of a new world, and it's almost unprecedented, much like it was even a year ago when this started to happen, just in a different way. So I think it's really about just trying to continue the consistency of those little touches. I mean, a lot of times it takes 7 points of outreach or 7 points of connection to move the needle on something. So for sales, it takes 7 points of outreach before you sometimes even get a call back or something in that regard. So kind of remembering that it's the consistency factor. And I like to try to add value where I can. So for example, I had a client that was looking to hire in digital marketing specifically for the Amazon platform. And I happened to come across an article on LinkedIn all about Amazon and how the business has really taken off more so than ever with COVID, and other retailer businesses are utilizing that platform. And I just immediately thought of her, and, you know, with no other agenda, I just sent it to her because I knew it would be helpful for her as she was trying to navigate this next hire. And I kept it very simple. I'm not here to flood somebody's inbox, but it was more just like, saw this article, thought it was interesting, and thought of you. Hope that you can get something out of it. And that was it. And it's those little things over time that are going to add up to bigger things. And it's kind of keeping that conversation, you know, going without any sort of an agenda, because at some point there will be that tipping point where now it's like, okay, we're trying to get to the next level. We've now settled in, but while we're still doing that, you know, just trying to help someone else out or ease their day so they know that you're thinking about them. And so when it does come down to a business conversation or decision down the road, you've already teed that up for yourself just by continuing to grow that relationship. And it's kind of the same thing in person. It's kind of touching base on somebody and saying, how are you doing? This is so odd, or it's so nice to be back in person, but things have changed, or just having that that personal connection, I think goes a long way, and just kind of asking somebody how they're doing and, just kind of calling out the elephant in the room a little bit of, this is so weird and we're kind of all in this together and here we are, it could be worse, but, and just kind of owning it a little bit too. And I think that transparency people really resonate with and can connect to.
Yeah. I think that, as I've noticed, like being back in person, it's that acknowledging that everyone lived a different version of hard, right? So like, oh, are you still comfortable going for us to sit outside with lunch? Or just like, hey, I'd love to catch up, or sorry that I didn't catch up, or stay in touch when we weren't employed. Like, like you said, kind of having those harder conversations, but acknowledging them for what they are and looking for that common ground to move forward.
Yeah, I think just being real with someone, like you said, and finding that common ground is going to cover much more ground, and get you kind of back to a place of some sort of comfortability quicker.
This is a little off the cuff, but I'm curious what your experience with like mentors and mentorship, especially now that we're living in this like virtual world, because I feel like a lot of people feel like they either lost connection with a lot of people in their industry that they look to as mentors, but maybe hadn't formally asked them to be a mentor, and are now kind of looking for those ways to get back in with those people that they maybe looked up to, but also maybe starting to look for how to form better mentorships, or finding a mentor or somebody else to be a mentee, or that kind of relationship building as well.
Yeah, great question. I have found that it has changed now that I'm a business owner. Mentors that I had in the past, I still hold very, high regard and still keep in touch with. But it's, it's a different dynamic when you have to put the business owner hat on. And if somebody hasn't been in that realm yet, then you can't really connect with them, at least on that level. So I found as a business owner, that was a little bit different of a dynamic and a little bit lonely, so to speak. I'm very lucky I have a business partner, and so we have each other, but I've always had, some sort of authority or somebody above me that I report into or that I look to for guidance. And I had to really seek that out, especially just with COVID and being home. So I just joined a couple more networking groups and tried to really seek out people in similar positions. I reconnected with some former colleagues that were now doing their own thing in business. And instead of colleagues now, it's kind of this mentorship. If they've started their business sooner than I did, now I'm coming to them asking questions. Or if I've seen somebody else has started a business after I have, then I try to extend that olive branch as well, because I know how that road can be, and it's very uncertain, and you're kind of looking for someone to just tell you if you're doing the right things, and you feel a little unsupervised, and it can be unsettling. So I've had to really seek that out, because, mentors, I think, are so critical for anybody in any stage of their, career or business. And sometimes those dynamics have to shift as you grow and shift within your own.
You pointed out something really interesting about looking for the person that's a couple steps ahead of you. I think that sometimes that's a really good way to think about it. And I think that sometimes we get really caught up in, I want to be here, so let me look for the person that's way up there, when really they're not the one that can tell you what's going to happen between here and there. You need somebody that's on the journey with you in a way. Yeah,
it's because it's definitely, it's a different, like you said, a different level. And so I really need someone who had just been through it and still kind of remembers that side of things, versus being on the other side, or having gone through that, at a different time, and being on that journey with you. So you're kind of feeling more similarities in that capacity.
Yeah. I have a leader who he started in what my current position is, but he was in that position 30 years ago. And everything is like, well, but when I did this job, or, but when I started in this, and it's like, he thinks that he's like connecting, and you have this thing in common because you both started there, and you're like, but you didn't live through the financial crash and a global pandemic while you were in this position. Like,
exactly.
you have not lived the same lifestyle that I have, but that's
not the same. I mean,
his way of showing that
so quickly. So even just in the last couple years, that would be a completely different conversation.
Right. Yeah. And so I think it's really interesting when we talk about it, because I'm like, yes, some people need to remember that times are different now, and the way you have to go about things are changing. So if someone were to be looking to pivot into a new industry, so talking to the millennial that's out there that's realizing that maybe where they've, maybe it's that they got the college degree in X, so they were going after, they're in teaching, and now they're realizing, like, I don't really want to be a teacher anymore, but maybe I want to go be a coach somewhere or something. And they're trying to figure out how to pivot industries. And what is the best ways that you see nowadays? And maybe it is virtual, but like starting to build those professional relationships with people outside of your current industry. And then how do you leverage those relationships to kind of help you land an interview in those new areas? Because I've realized that everything is about who you know nowadays.
Yes, it is. I would say to look at the industry that you want to be in and start connecting with those people, whether it's virtual, whether it's showing up to the networking events once that is kind of back to normal a little bit more.
Hopefully coming soon.
Yes, hopefully coming soon, right? So you can really learn the players, the major players in terms of business, know the language. You just want to absorb like a sponge as much as you possibly can and learn before you really kind of try to land that interview. And it can be a quick process, but I think you want to just immerse yourself in that. And it's very, easy to do through LinkedIn, because you almost have this cheat sheet of somebody's profile where you can see their activity. You can see if they're in any sort of virtual groups. And once you join those groups, then you get the updates of what's happening, and you start to learn the people, you start to learn the language, and every industry speaks a little bit different of a language and those keywords, and you're going to start to see consistencies and where, maybe certain events are getting more action of people, or, more people that you want to be immersed with than others. So do your homework up front and then be efficient with your time and show up to the ones that's going to give you the most bang for your buck. And when you start to do that consistently, you're going to start showing up in those people's feeds, and your name is going to sound familiar. So when you start to have these conversations, it's not the first time somebody's going to be like, oh yeah, I think I saw you here, or I saw that you comment on this. You want to start to create that familiarity, so then when you do start to make that outreach, they've seen your name before, they've seen you before, and it doesn't feel so cold in terms of an outreach, and you're more likely to get that return. It's, again, building that like, know, and trust, and then you can start to connect the dots on, oh, we know this person in common. I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody accept my friend request through LinkedIn or pick up the phone or whatever that might be, because they saw that we had this one mutual person in common, and they knew this person so well. And if they knew me, then I must be somebody worth their time in speaking to. And I've had people tell me that. And I'm glad that they do, because then it just kind of reiterates, what I'm talking about, and also what we're experiencing. And it's that connecting those bridges and making them seem like not such a small gap. That's how you really start to make those pivots and those shifts. And they're little by little. It's not this huge giant 180 leap. You're going to have to kind of do a little 90-degree pivot here. And then once you get a little comfortable, you'll do another 90-degree pivot. And so it's just these baby steps. And then all of a sudden you look around and you've turned 360 around, or whatever that might be. And so it's just kind of starting small and knowing that you're kind of putting these little stepping stones in place to get to where you want to be.
Something that I have, I feel like millennials, because, like, we don't even like to call it make a doctor's appointment. I talk about that a lot because I hate that. And every time I say that, millennials are like, oh my God, yep, that's me. Yeah. But like, you do actually have to interact with people. And I think that sometimes it's as simple as, like you said, like commenting on the article, and you're like, you're already reading the article. Take 2 seconds to write a thoughtful comment on it. It's the same thing with building a business. Like, that's how you get to know people in the entrepreneurial space, is just commenting on their post. It seems silly. It goes a long way for people when they're starting a business. comment on their stories, fill out the polls, comment on their Instagram TVs, watch their Instagram lives. Every little thing helps. And so I love that you pointed out to just start to build the relationships that way, because I think that that's also another one of those like easy to do, but easy not to do. And it really doesn't take that much time.
And people are so appreciative, especially when they are starting a business, that somebody took the time to do that. And that's kind of how you get that conversation going and you start to stand out and gain that familiarity as well. And if you don't want to comment, then share it with somebody else and tell that person that you did so, and just be like, I really loved this and I shared this. And, you know, it's just that kind of give back portion of it as well, and it takes 2 seconds, but so many people don't do that, and it's the people that take the time to actually do that are going to get the response.
Goes back to my previous point of like so many people don't want to call and make the doctor's appointment, right? And so when you do, you're a step ahead of the game. And I feel like it's as silly and translatable as it is, like it's the same idea of like, there's a lot of people that won't do it. So be the one that does.
Exactly.
So was there ever a particular point in your story? I talk a lot about like mindset and building your mindset toolkit. And I think when a lot of us have kind of had these big pivotal moments, it's because something has flipped with a mindset switch, right? Where like something all of a sudden was like, and this makes sense now. Did you ever have a point that like stands out in your story of like across your whole career or where you got to where you are now, where you felt like you had a mindset shift that really kind of was like triggering and changed the game for you?
You know, I grew up an athlete, and so it taught me very early on that endurance, you know, pays off, and that, you know, persistence. It's not so much about kind of what happens, but how you react to it and being able to kind of pivot very quickly. I like to fail fast and pivot and learn from it, and really failure is just data. So if you can really just take that feedback for what it is and then apply it, I found it so much more of an efficient way to get to where you want to be than to kind of sit and dwell in it. So, you know, I've certainly had things that have come up that I didn't see coming, challenges, you know, that I didn't account for, that kind of knocked me off my path or whatever that might be. Even with COVID, I wouldn't be a business owner today if COVID hadn't happened. It was never something I would have considered, and it wasn't until it was the most viable option for where I was sitting at the time that I thought, okay, I can go ahead and do this and pivot and see what happens, or I can let this fear overcome me and kind of just sit it out and not do anything about it. And it's the times where I've been kind of faced with those decisions that it's challenged me to level up, but in a way that I really needed to get to where I wanted to be. And if something hadn't come along to kind of clear the path for me to really see it, then I probably wouldn't have done it myself. So it just, I think it always happens, you know, there's peaks and valleys, and it's really just making sure that you are ready for whatever comes your way. And if you have that mindset of just that kind of consistency and persistence, then, you know, I think that's really what it is. It's a decision to kind of make the best of what's in front of you.
Yeah. Failure is data. Yep. That was my favorite thing that you just said, because I was like, ooh, I like that. That's a good quote.
Yeah. It's not always easy, and sometimes you don't want to see it, but at least it's information that you can use and then you can pivot from.
Yeah. So I like to wrap up every conversation with one of my favorite questions. And I think that's because millennials are really bad at giving ourselves credit for when we've done something really hard. We're very quick to be like, yep, that's over with, moving on. But we don't stop and celebrate ourselves for actually doing something hard and making it through the hard stuff. So when you look back a year from now, what do you think you'll be most proud of yourself for?
I think taking the leap to start a business during a pandemic, no less. where there was no blueprint for how to do this. It wasn't even just starting a business and you kind of follow the path. It was starting a business during a pandemic where most businesses are completely shut down or not moving forward or just trying to keep their heads above water and kind of walking away from something that was a little bit more steady to forge my own path and just see, what happens. I think at the end of the day, I'd rather look back and say, that may not have worked out, but at least I took the leap and I did that and I put myself out there, and that's hard to do versus letting the fear of failure win and, always wondering what if.
This all goes back to, this is exactly why I named the podcast, But What If You Did? Because I am the queen bee when it comes to dwelling in what ifs. And so this was to teach myself to get out of that habit. And I think it's an important reminder for all of our fellow millennials out there. But what if you did is a much better way to live than but what if.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, whether you believe you can or not, you're right. So I choose to believe that I can do something, and it may open up another door that I never thought of, but I never would have got there if I hadn't tried.
Yep. It always goes back to putting in the effort and doing the little things. I know that seems like such a silly thing, but it really does come back to the consistency and the showing up even when it's hard and taking action even when it's uncomfortable and even when it doesn't feel like it's going to pay off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this has been such a lovely conversation. Thank you so much for taking time to chat with us today. I've really loved getting to hear your story.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Why don't you tell my listeners where they can connect with you at?
Yeah, they can go to cultivatedtalent.com. That is our website. They can also find me on LinkedIn, Emily DeSilva. Feel free to just connect with me there, or they can find us on Instagram at Cultivated Talent.
Awesome. Well, friends, this has been so much fun. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Please take a few moments out of your day to go connect with Emily over on social, and I will see you all right back here, same time next week.
Thanks, Alyson.
Just wanted to say a quick thank you for coming to hang with me for a bit today. If today's conversation vibed with you, I would so appreciate if you took a few seconds to subscribe, rate, and review. This really helps to get the podcast into the hands of new listeners. For show notes and links to all resources discussed in today's conversation, head on over to butwhatifyoudidpod.com/listen now. Remember, friends, it's truly on us to inspire the next generation of change makers. So I'll leave you with a little food for thought. It's one thing to change our world. It's another to change the future.